Hello, hello! Welcome to the Decay Learning Center, here to teach you about the weird, the macabre, and the fascinating bits of history that are gonna haunt the corners of your mind. I'm your host, Senta Decay, and I've been dying to meet you. Episode 1: The Healing Bone Goo of St. Nicholas. For today's episode, we're gonna cover a topic that is near and dear to my heart. We're talking about the magical healing goo that comes from St. Nicholas's bones. Now you might be thinking, it's April. Sant, why are we doing Santa bone goo now? You should have done this in December. Well, you're wrong. We're gonna get to this in a little bit, but you'll see that we are a month away from the magical bone goo day, which happens in May. So this is actually perfect timing to cover Santa bone goo. But before we get into that, we need to talk about the man himself. Who exactly was St. Nicholas? So who was St. Nicholas? You might think of him as the Coca-Cola interpretation of Santa Claus that we're all familiar with nowadays, but St. Nicholas was a very real person. Born in 270 AD in what is modern-day Turkey to wealthy Christian parents, St. Nicholas inherited their fortune after their deaths and dedicated his life to serving God and others. We're not going to go into his full life story, but we'll give a few examples on how he got known to be the Santa Claus of today. One thing that's tied to St. Nicholas is the tradition of giving gifts that we're familiar with. This came about because St. Nicholas lived near a father and his 3 daughters who were struggling monetarily. The father couldn't provide dowries for his daughter and was just having a rough time making ends meet and feeding them all. He was really desperate and thought that his only option was to sell them into prostitution just to survive. Somehow St. Nicholas heard about this and went to their house one night and threw a bag of gold coins through their window. The next morning the father found the gold and was overjoyed and used it as a dowry for his eldest daughter and arranged a marriage right away. St. Nicholas heard this and was happy to hear how the father used the gold coins. So he returned another night and threw a second bag of gold coins through their window. The father, as you might expect, used this second bag of gold as a dowry for his middle daughter, but then realized St. Nicholas was probably going to come back for the third daughter. He didn't know who was leaving these gold coins and wanted to thank them, so he started staying up all night, each night, waiting for the man to return. And St. Nicholas did return. And when he did and threw the third bag of coins through the window, the father rushed out to thank him and express his gratitude. Realizing who St. Nicholas was, one of his neighbors, he told everyone in the town of his deeds. And that started the legend of St. Nicholas's generosity. And that's where the concept of sneaking gifts in the middle of the night and leaving them as a surprise came from. But beyond that, St. Nicholas was also known as being a legendary protector of children. Now this story has a few variations. One variation is that there was a butcher who lured and captured 3 young boys, murdering them and stuffing their bodies into a pickling vat. Somehow St. Nicholas learned of this and went to the butcher and prayed to God and brought them back to life. That's right, St. Nicholas is canonically a necromancer. This story, as I said, has another variation, but still has to do with pickled children, oddly enough. The other version was that there were 3 young students who were traveling to go learn under a famed teacher, and they happened to be traveling the same road that St. Nicholas was making a journey on. They arrived at an inn before St. Nicholas did, and the innkeeper murdered them and stuffed their bodies in, you guessed it, a pickling vat. St. Nicholas stopped at that very same inn that night and went to spend the night. As he slept, he had nightmares of the 3 murdered students in the pickling vat. He woke up and went to the basement where he found the students and, once again, prayed to God until they came back to life. That is 2 stories of being a necromancer. But that's not what we learned from him. We learned he protected children. So between that and the gift giving, you could kind of see where the concept of Santa Claus came from as being jolly old Saint Nick. Another fun tidbit about St. Nicholas, which really doesn't have anything to do with our Santa bone goo story, but I needed to include this, because this isn't behavior you think of when you think of saints, was St. Nicholas punched a man in the face and was jailed for it. That's right, St. Nicholas was on a council where the church gathered to confront a heretic, and when the heretic began to blaspheme against Jesus, St. Nicholas was so outraged that he punched the man in the face and went to jail. It was brief. The other bishops got him out of jail when they realized he was doing it out of the love of Jesus in his heart. But he didn't mess around when it came to defending Jesus. So this story is already super cool, as you can imagine, very up my alley. We've got Necromancer St. Nicholas, but we're just getting started. That was just a brief introduction to the man, so we can move on to the next subject, which is the bones of St. Nicholas. Now, St. Nicholas undoubtedly lived a fascinating life, but unfortunately, in 343 AD, December, in fact, St. Nicholas died in Myra, which is modern-day Turkey. This is where he'd originally be buried, in his cathedral church in Myra. But his body would not stay there. That's right, we have a corpse theft. So his remains were later, quote-unquote, moved to Bari, Italy in 1087. I mean, quite some time had passed here, so you might be wondering how this came about. Well, in 1087, a group of merchants from Italy stopped by and disguised themselves as pilgrims wanting to visit the Church of St. Nicholas. They went there and stole his bones and brought them all the way back to Bari, Italy. A new shrine was then made there, which became a pilgrimage center that's still visited today. This, you might think, is crazy enough, but this is just the main resting site of some of his bones. That's right, they divided his body, but we'll get into that a little bit later, because this site in Bari is where our magical Santa bone goo of healing powers comes into play. Now I should note that the mana of St. Nicholas, which I am calling the magical Santa bone goo, that actually started before his body was stolen. But historically, the phenomenon was only formally recorded and continued after his move to Italy. So the tradition began back in what's modern-day Turkey, where his original burial site was, where his tomb was said to weep a holy curative oil. Who saw oil leaking out of a tomb and decided to consume it? I'm not sure. But the tradition still continues to this day. Following the theft of his body, the mana began flowing from his new tomb once more. Now this substance is formally collected by a group of clergymen on May 9th, which we are close to Santa Bone Goo Day. Now this harvesting happens in May because May was actually the month that St. Nicholas's body arrived in Italy. So this mana is viewed as a relic, and there are people who travel to Italy because they view it as a cure-all for various ailments. A small amount of it is collected with holy water and bottled for distribution to the faithful, often with prayers, which unfortunately means there's a counterfeit market for it. People will often sell counterfeit mana of St. Nicholas to innocent tourists who don't know any better, but even more fascinating than that is there is actually a historical presence of poison being sold as the mana of St. Nicholas. During the 17th century, there was a highly effective odorless poison that was being sold as the mana of St. Nicholas, mostly to unhappy women in horrible marriages. It was advertised that it would discreetly eliminate their troubles and issues, and in a way it did, by murdering their husbands. Now, the woman that was selling this poisonous mana of St. Nicholas was caught and executed, but allegedly she was responsible for the deaths of over 600 people with this gimmick, which is insane. That's such a high death count. I mean, that's like what Elizabeth Bathory is famed to be, like the most prolific serial killer, and she had over 600 people, so that's crazy. So just to sum up where we are so far, we had necromancy with pickled children, we had the theft of a corpse, and we have a historical tradition of harvesting liquid that comes out of a tomb in 2 different locations and then consuming it as a healing tonic. And then we also had someone who supposedly killed 600 people by selling poison under the guise of being this healing tonic. This has been a wild story so far. We're not done. So now, we already mentioned that only part of his body is in Italy. That's because the skeleton of St. Nicholas was divided up and pieces of it have been shipped worldwide to many different churches as relics. If you're unfamiliar with the Catholic religion, they consider relics to be things that saints touched, things they blessed, or even parts of their body. These relics are classified based on their proximity to a saint, and there are 3 classes. First class relics, which were part of a saint's bodies, which can include bones, organs, hair. Second class relics, which were items that were owned, used, or worn by a saint during their life. And then third class relics are objects that have been touched to a first or second class relic. So if you have a second class relic that is an item of clothing worn by a saint, you can touch a rosary to it, and then that is now a third class relic. So the bones of St. Nicholas are considered a first class relic and are a great honor to be housed within a church. As I said, these have been shipped all over. There are pieces of it in the United States. Virginia church has a piece of St. Nicholas's bone, as well as a vial of the manna. But that's not all. There's also relics of St. Nicholas in Thailand, Ukraine, Scotland, Spain, Russia, Romania. I mean, the list just goes on. He is quite divided up and sent worldwide for many people to experience the blessings of these relics. But what's even more fascinating by this is something I didn't realize until researching this video, was a relic of St. Nicholas was actually lost during 9/11. In New York, the St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox Church had a relic of St. Nicholas that was lost in the aftermath of 9/11. The church was later rebuilt as the St. Nicholas National Shrine at Ground Zero, and in July 2022 was given new relics of St. Nicholas from Italy. So that was the story of the fascinating life of St. Nicholas and the magical healing properties of his bone goo. I hope you enjoyed and found this story as fascinating as I did, and I'll catch you next time for another episode of the Decay Learning Center. Till then,